Justice in Virginia. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes just to kind of introduce the event. This event is really focused on issues around race and environment in Virginia. And that's going to be really closely related to this idea called environmental justice. We're also going to talk about the concept of environmental racism. I'm not going to give like a total overview of all of that now, but just briefly so you kind of understand some of the history. I know some of you who are here from my class, you've probably heard me talk about this. So race and environment is largely or closely connected to environmental justice, and that's a social movement that really starts in the Black Southern United States. There's a particular community that a lot of historians trace it to. It's called Warren County, North Carolina. And basically this place, this area, it was a fairly economically depressed area, largely white farmers and a lot of black residents. Fairly poor area, but in the late 70s, kind of in the wake or in the general context of increasing chemical regulations, there was a contractor who basically was kind of dumping toxic waste, getting rid of toxic waste, and he distributed it along about 200 miles of North Carolina's roadways. And basically what ends up happening when this is discovered, the state of North Carolina has to decide where they're going to put it. They decide to put it in this town called Warren County, which is largely African American. It also had a very shallow water table, it was only about 13 feet from the surface. At the time, the normal regulation was 50 feet. They had to get waivers for that just to place it there. But there's a lot of details about this. You can read more into it. A lot of interesting history around Warren County. But the main thing is that it starts sort of with African American community and allies resisting toxic waste or hazardous waste. And out of that, what ends up happening there, and we'll talk more about this, because this is just kind of going to be just setting the scene, but it's largely seen as a moment where the civil rights movement and the environmental movement kind of intersect with one another, because this little teeny town gets a lot of attention when members of the NAACP and kind of high-profile civil rights leaders like Reverend Benjamin Chavez, who coins the term environmental racism, gets involved, apply their skills. And also applies a lot of the strategies of civil disobedience from the civil rights movement to this little town resisting toxic waste. And in the fall of 1982, there's a whole series of mass protests. There's hundreds of people who are arrested, and ultimately the landfill is sited there. They do delay that. But what happens from there, even though the landfill is sited there, later it does leak like people had predicted, but it sort of ignites an entire movement, really looking at sort of issues of social inequality and how they kind of intersect with environmental problems, especially exposure to environmental hazards. So that's a big theme that we're going to be looking at today. And the reason why I call it racialized ecologies is also because in recent times, people like David Pellow, who's a scholar who does a lot of work, he's a sociologist who does work in environmental justice, has been doing a lot to kind of expand the concepts and the frameworks that we use and think about in terms of environmental justice. So in addition to including sort of axes of social inequality, like around race, class, gender to a large extent, if you think about the distinction of women's bodies, reproductive justice, things like that. There are also non-human dimensions, whether you're talking about animals, plants, the built environment, that can also impact and shape the quality of human life and the quality of communities in general, which have both human and non-human components to them. And I also like the concept of ecology, because I think it also helps to draw attention to the fact that the EJ movement, even though it's often sort of framed or reduced to like just environmental health movement or an environmental kind of human illness movement, largely due to the influence of indigenous peoples and others, as well as minorities who have been participating in environmental activities and not always recognized for it. There has been a long-standing recognition of the interplay between humans and nature, of the sacredness of the earth in terms of quality of life in general. And so that whole idea of ecologies and race, I want to kind of think of those together. And one final thought that or at least point that I want to make is that in this space, largely in the tradition of the space, we're thinking about sort of holding space for race. So the argument here is sort of not that people are only marginalized by race or anything like that, but in the wake of just history, a lot of well-documented kind of retreats from race in terms of engaging it, I think it's important that even as EJ continues to become more popular, expand, and widen, that we also continue to about the concepts that we use, especially around race and racism, that's particularly salient today with everything going on politically, not necessarily brand new things, but a lot of things becoming increasingly visible, not only due to a kind of, more extreme government, but also because of the influence of technology, social media, visual technologies, things that highlight things like police brutality, stuff that's not really new but is more visible. So these are some of the themes that I wanted to kind of think about today, and I kind of left them loose on purpose because I want this to be kind of a launching point for more dialogue, more discussion, the development of more concepts, ideas, and events that involve not just sort of academics and scholars, but also the community around Richmond. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to hold it in a space like this, and also include people who've really done a lot of work that are really working in the environmental justice community. And with that being said, I want to really quickly turn it over to Ha, just so you can introduce the space, and then I'm the teaching faculty at VCU in the sociology department, and it's my first year there working full time. And I also teach a class that looks a lot at stuff like this. And one other thing I wanted to sort of mention was that this is something that's very Virginia focused. I know that just from interacting with my students and from people around the community, there's tremendous interest in this area around issues of environmental justice, around racial justice. And oftentimes, we don't always get exposed to things that are local, especially if you live in an area like this. This isn't necessarily Flint, Michigan. It's not New Orleans. It's not any of the sort of more high-profile places where you've seen a lot of studies. But you're going to hear some really interesting cases, experiences, just kind of general ways of life around this area that intersect with issues of race, ecology, and justice. So I also wanted to show a video clip. So this is Pastor Paul, who is, let me say a quick thing about this. So I know a lot of you are involved in pipeline issues, pipeline struggles in Buckingham and other places with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, two giant fossil fuel infrastructure projects, widely resisted, and resistance is ongoing. A lot of people out there really showing not only that there is worry about this, but also that people are not afraid to come together and resist, even after other modes of intervening through legal systems, court systems may not always work. This is also an important tradition to kind of think about. So this is Pastor Paul. One element of the pipeline is a compressor station in Buckingham County. It's not only 85% black, Union Hill community in Buckingham County, but it's also a traditional freedmen's community, which means for hundreds of years, black Americans have lived in this space. And there's a tremendous amount of worry, stress going on about the compressor station that is part of this giant pipeline project, one of the giant pipeline projects in Buckingham. So that's one issue, and unfortunately there's a group from Buckingham that wanted to make it, but in part because of everything going on there right now with people trying to resist and protect their land, things like that. There's a lot going on up there, so they weren't able to make it, but do look out for an event in the fall. There's going to be a political ecology event, and this gathering right here will also kind of be part of that event. So those folks will be able to come down. I also encourage people to go out and be informed about what's going on, maybe see how you can get involved. But this is Pastor Paul, so I'll play this real quick.
Good afternoon, Mr. Norton. I'm Pastor Paul Wilson of Union Hill and Grove Baptist Church up in Buckingham County, Virginia.
Yeah, sorry about the volume. This is as loud as this goes.
The close compressor station for the ACP is in walking distance of our Marvin Church. You had a standing invitation from a great congregation to come visit us and come see what's going to be possibly destroyed, a way of life, a community with rural, and you love the rural lifestyle. We always want you to come visit us and be with us so that you can see firsthand what's happening with corporate greed and about falsehoods that have been told. Come and see the truth for yourself so that you can be a true eyewitness, that you will know firsthand of what's happening to communities like us in Buckingham. And I'm a Democrat. I voted for you. My wife holds an elected office. She voted for you. But we need your continued support. And so that you can go beyond politics, so that you can truly be for the people, for the constituents that really support you. And we love you. We wish you well in office. Please come see the real people of Virginia in beautiful rural Buckingham County.
Okay, and after that, so for one, I wanted you to think about Buckingham. The question that I'm asking is really not about the governor necessarily, but for those of you who may or may not know about Buckingham, because again, this is just sort of someone speaking on behalf, so this doesn't really show everything, but I just wanted to ask folks if any questions or reactions people had. And thanks you, Bakura, for encouraging this particular thing. Yeah. That's all yours.
How is the new environmental office affecting environmental justice movement?
Well, as far as I know, there have been tremendous cuts. I know the head of that office, who served under Clinton and George Bush, he's left. So yeah, as you know, the EPA is pretty much right now is functioning as a climate denial organization, Scott Pruitt. So yeah, it's not really good. And again, I think that's irrespective of even a Democrat-Republican thing. But I think that's bad, period. So any other questions before we move on? Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could speak to the dynamics between like Yogaville, Buckingham people, and then like other people in the area.
Right, so I'm going to comment on that because like right now I'm not living in Buckingham. There's a lot of people putting themselves in line in Buckingham. And I don't live in Yogaville. We can talk about that, you and I, but I don't want to speak on behalf of like that community. But there's some interesting things going on, but rather them say that. Okay. Any other questions before I go to the...
Well, people are invited out on the 22nd.
Oh yeah.
Both Yogaville and Union Hill, and talk to people for yourself. Arrival at 10 and through 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 22nd. And so you could go talk to people yourself if anybody's interested. We could probably even figure out some carpooling and all of that.
Yeah, I think there's like a Facebook page event for it. It's an Earth Day event in Buckingham. Cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit to how like Richmond is like connected or like supporting folks in Buckingham?
That again, I think there are folks in this room that you can probably talk to. There are a lot of people, and people that you probably know directly, who have been involved in that struggle. And I think it's great that they're out there supporting the communities. But I think this is a good space to be in because I think there are people who have been directly over there connected to it. But there's a lot of connections going on, and I think that they're increasing. And Richmond does have kind of a tradition of resisting Dominion and fossil fuel infrastructure. Okay, anyone else?
This is really beautiful that you all took your time to come out. Finally, since spring has decided to show up. You know, we've been waiting on spring for a long time now. Like Travis had said, I come from a long time of criminal justice reform advocacy and protests. I came over into the environmental world this year, fight against pipelines.
clean air and clean water, and that was it for me. But I was kind of thrusted over into the environmental world because of my criminal justice advocacy to make those type of connections. Because they were missing. And so a lot of times we deal with issues singularly when they are plural. And it's important that we make those intersections and make them count. And so what I did was look at what was happening to marginalized communities. And basically those communities became dumping sites for multi-billion-dollar companies, whether it was coal ash, whether it was compressor stations, whether it was coal ponds or just toxins in the air or polluting water. Those areas were filled with vulnerable people that became susceptible to those type of environmental hazards. I'm come from Newport, downtown Newport News, and there is a coal plant that is right in the heart of where I'm from. We were there's a mica industry that let all kinds of toxins out into the air, and my son now suffers from chronic severe asthma so badly that he's disabled from asthma. I have a 10-year-old that has asthma, exercise induced, and my oldest child has chronic bronchitis due to mold exposure in marginalized homes. That's another big issue that is not really out there yet, but mold is a serious toxin that costs a lot of money in order just to be able to tell what type of mold you're being exposed to. Remediation can get up into the thousands of dollars. Marginalized people do not have it. They don't have it to move out of these apartments, so they just stay exposed to these type of toxins. And so for me, when I came into the environmental world, I knew from the criminal justice standpoint that if we litter, we get a fine. If Dominion litters, they get a profit. If we poison somebody's water, 9 times out of 10, we're going to prison for a very, very long time. And so when we have legislators that allow corporations to do this, we must hold them fully accountable to the fullest extent of the law, that we are held accountable. And so my position in the environmental world is to make those connections and make them very visible and call them out so that people can say, okay, now if we're going to have this double standard, then how are we going to approach it in that manner? And it's time to start filing criminal charges, you know, to hold these people accountable. And so that is what my position is. I'm sort of like kind of Robin Hood for the hood. It's and I'm okay with saying it because I do come from a low-income area, predominantly African American. I've seen the oppression. I've lived it. I'm a victim of the criminal justice system. Being out front makes you a bullet target. They zoom right on in on you when you're dealing with politics and policy. And when you have marginalized communities, you don't have people like together like this. They are scared to death to organize because they come right in for you. And so I'm just thankful for my ancestors that gave me the spirit to fight and to be able to endure all of these things. Because it's really important, and I hope that you all, if you're not involved as of today, I hope today you make a decision to really get involved with this environmental, I call it injustice movement, because we need everybody. We need every voice. We need every vote. It all counts. Thank you.
I think we're ready. So hi everyone, my name is Mike Ewall. I'm the founder and director of Energy Justice Network. We're a national group based in Philadelphia, and I live in Northern Virginia and work with folks in Maryland, DC, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and a bit all over the country. So I'm going to walk you through some of the stuff that I usually teach in my workshops on environmental racism, and some of it I might gloss over a little quicker because some of it's been covered or you learned it in class, and I'll focus in part on some of the stuff that we've been focusing on here in Virginia and what the actual community impacts are in some of the communities that we're familiar with. So go ahead. All right, so this just little cover slide shows some of the folks in Louisiana where they actually recreate right next to one of the big oil refineries in that region. And so you see a lot of communities, including in Virginia, that are literally fence line like this, that are just like they live, work, play right next to major industrial polluters. So environmental racism, I should probably make you guess what it is before I tell you, but all right, we'll save the interactivity for a few minutes. Basically, is where communities of color are disproportionately impacted by polluting industries. And it's been expanded ever since Warren County to be a concept that includes also, well, why don't we all have access to the good things equally too? So it's a bit of both, but a lot of it came out of the suffering of people who are disproportionately polluted by toxic industries. And it doesn't have to be intentional. So a lot of times there's this chicken versus the egg thing. It's like, well, did the people move to the polluter or did the polluter move to them? Is it really intentional? Because if it's not intentional, it doesn't count, right? But it does. And the Civil Rights Act even makes it very clear that it's illegal for anyone receiving federal funding, so the federal government, state, even a lot of local governments, to do actions that have a discriminatory effect regardless of intent. Now, unfortunately, we can't sue them unless we can prove it's intentional, but it's still illegal on paper. The government can sue themselves. It doesn't happen very often, but it's still a violation of the Civil Rights Act, so we can still make that claim because that's just a fact. Next. So racism usually is not this obvious. This is a woman I've worked with for many years, Zuline Mayfield, in Chester, Pennsylvania, living literally across the railroad tracks and the fence from the largest trash incinerator in the country, in a community notoriously known as one of the worst cases of environmental racism in the nation. And her community office, I'm sorry, it's not as visible as it should be, but it was broken into twice. And once the vandals scrawled KKK on the wall, and she left that there for as long as they had the office and just let that article she had posted on the wall move down as it was and just left it there so people can see, sometimes it's just straight in your face about race. And until that happened, it was arguable. They would be like, oh, well, maybe it's just because you're poor. And a lot of white folks like to escape to that and say, it's just because they're poor. And I'm going to present to you with actual hard numbers that it's not just about people being poor. Go ahead. So first, there are some examples where intentional discrimination actually leaked out. A lot of the times, we theorize about it, maybe some white guys in a boardroom are doing something and saying, stick it there, but a lot of times this stuff doesn't leak out, but a few times it did. So I'm going to give you some examples. In California, in 1984, they were trying to build 34 trash incinerators in the state of California. Only 3 ended up getting built. But in the course of trying to get them built, they hired Sorrell Associates, which is still around, so I'm sure they love the fact that they come up in the top page of Google now because I put their report online. This wasn't supposed to leak out. But this is a cover page that a group we know did that summarizes the report. And the report looks at who is more or less likely to resist noxious facilities. And they found all kinds of criteria based on income, education, religion, you name it, was in this list. And nowhere in here does it flat out say anything about race. However, all 3 trash incinerators that got built in California were exclusively in communities that were almost entirely Hispanic. The 3 hazardous waste landfills built in the state also, same story. And so you see these trends, and when you look at those communities, they overlap with Catholic, low income, high score, less education. A lot of these same things overlap with race, and that's why you see the racist effects of what you do. And this is like a playbook for the industry, this report that came out, because they all use similar stuff if they think about who's going to fight us or not. This is in the back of their head somewhere in a lot of cases. Go ahead. So there was also an example with the nuclear waste dump they tried to build in North Carolina. And they were literally doing what's called a window survey. They went around the state and they were looking out their car window and was like, is this a community that we want to have in the siting process or not? And then went through it. And a lot of these are economic criteria, but they were like residents of site minority owned, in. Trailers everywhere, in. Distressed area, in. But fairly affluent, out. A lot of it was financial criteria, but they also were looking at race, and they were brazen enough to write this down in a report that also leaked out, and this is part of the report. Go ahead. There was also an example in Louisiana where the only time the federal government said, you can't build this there because it's environmental racism. That will never happen again because it's not actually illegal to do this. But they misinterpreted Clinton's executive order on environmental justice as something that actually had teeth. And in the course of that, they stopped a uranium enrichment plant from being built in a community that when they narrowed it down from over 100 sites to the one they picked, they found the blackest community they could find. And it was grinding poverty. It was like $5,000 annual income, no running water, and that's where they decided they're going to put this giant new uranium enrichment plant. Now, thankfully, that was stopped. Stopped again twice in Tennessee, but then they built another community color in New Mexico, near the Mexican border, in a Hispanic community. So, but if you go on our website and check this out, it's on the ejnet.org, which is on your handout. You'll find stuff from this case in Louisiana. Read this, because it's a very powerful wording. I've never seen the federal government, especially the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is like one of the most racist of energy industries, the nuclear industry, for them to say something this bold about institutionalized racism and how you have to uncover some rocks to look at it, and it's not going to be blatantly obvious. And to have a federal agency actually saying this was really shocking and powerful. Okay. So my indigenous friends like to say that the environmental justice movement really can go back this far and trace to when white man first set foot on this continent. So we can go back that far, but the terms, go ahead, didn't come around until a lot later. And a lot of folks think that if Martin Luther King weren't shot in his work in Memphis when he was starting to organize striking garbage workers, we would have seen the environmental racism term come around a lot sooner. But unfortunately, that did not happen. But there are other examples from the 70s where you started to see civil rights complaints in Houston around landfills in black communities. And so some of it was starting before the term even came around in Warren County, which Travis already talked to you about. So we won't get into that. Go ahead. And this is just a picture from the Warren County arrests, and yeah, it's fine to skip that. So there was a report that came out. When they were studying this, they were looking at, well, where are the hazardous waste landfills, because that's what they were proposing in Warren County. Where are the hazardous waste landfills in the southeastern U.S.? So initially they looked and they found that 3 of the 4 in the southeastern region of EPA, which is about 8 states in the southeastern U.S., were in African American communities, even though black folks were 20% of that region population. And so clearly there was a disparity. And that led to this report later in '87 when they looked at the whole country for hazardous waste facilities, and they found that race is more of a deciding factor than class. So when you look at this and you ask the question, who has a better chance? If you have a middle-income black community versus a low-income white community, you ask the question, who has a better chance of having a hazardous waste facility planned for their community? This could be the middle-income black community on average, because that's what the trends are showing in this industry and across a lot of other industries too. Go ahead. So environmental justice is, we just read that out, so I won't have to explain that, but they came up with it in the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991 in DC. Pretty powerful. I was involved just before that, but didn't know about that, so I got to go to the second one, which was in 2002, which is pretty powerful. But go ahead. And this is Dana Austin when she was still on this planet. She was involved very heavily in the movement and was part of that first summit, defining the environment broader than we usually do. So go ahead. Okay, so all right, and I'll lead into this, and I think that's my car in the background, but I want to ask you about those questions, or sorry, the principles that you read out. Now, when you read those, what stood out for you? There's a lot more in those principles than save the bunnies, trees, and whales, right? So what did you hear in that sounded like it was outside of the box of what you usually think of as an environmental issue? Just call out. Anyone?
Self-determination.
Self-determination, right? Okay. What else? Informed consent. So there are a lot of democracy ideas in here. You'll see more under number 7's ideas about democracy, who gets to make decisions. What else?
Directly addressed consumption.
Mm-hmm.
So that's often part of environmental movements, but not always connected to environmental justice movements.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that in a second. What else?
Workers' rights to have a livelihood and not have to work in an unsafe environment.
Right, so workers' rights, the rights of people even working at home, exposed to chemicals, all kinds of stuff. Anything else?
Quality healthcare.
Quality healthcare, so healthcare is an issue.
Experimentation.
Right. Experimentation, vaccination, forced sterilization of women of color, which we still, just in the past few years, this came out in 1991, right? In the past few years, California prisons, an issue with forced sterilization of women of color, still happening. What else? Anything?
And that's happening all over the world, too, from a global perspective.
Totally, yeah. Okay, so look at number 17 for a second. What's different about number 17 than the first 16?
Focus on the individual.
Focused on individual, right. So what does that mean about the first 16? What are the first 16 focusing on if not individuals? Well, people or individuals. Get a little more specific than that.
Accountability, individual accountability.
Well, individual accountability is number 17. So the first 16, who has to change?
External versus internal.
Government, right? So government's one dominant institution that controls a lot of things, right?
Corporations.
Corporations, like number 14, talks about multinational corporations. So the dominant institutions of our time, government, including the military, which is the biggest polluter on earth, and corporations, are these institutions that need to be held accountable if we're going to have environmental justice. And I interpreted this as intentional when I saw these principles, and then years later I got to talk to the people actually in the room writing them. And I'm like, am I right when I see that you put this individual change thing as number 17 and just one of 17 points? Was that intentional? And they're like, yeah, that was definitely on purpose. So I want to spell this out a little bit, just in a story I want to share. But first, let me explain why I have this up here. So y'all seen the word radical in math class, right? Why is it in math class? What's the word radical mean in political terminology? I heard it. The root, exactly. So radical basically means getting to the root of a problem. So it's not like dressing in all black clothes and throwing a rock through a Starbucks window in Seattle. You know, that's what they want us to think it means. Radical just means, it should be a label we all want to wear. It's what these principles say, because it's getting to the root of the problem. It's saying we should be talking about fundamental things like who makes decisions. We should have an economy that doesn't involve making toxic poisons and polluting communities anywhere. There's nowhere in that document that you'll see anything that says, spread the pollution around better and we're cool with it. Did you see that in there? Because I didn't see that when I read that, and I read it many times. So I think it's a pretty radical document in that sense. About some of this more. When I was in undergrad, I once saw a pickup truck. I went to undergrad in central Pennsylvania, so pickup trucks weren't so unusual. And I saw a pickup truck that had 2 bumper stickers on it. One was a pro-logging sticker. It was like, have you hugged a logger today? And the other one just had 3 words. And it said, Smokey needs you. And I was blown away by how these 2 stickers could be on the same truck, but more importantly, about that second sticker, had no pictures, nothing other than Smokey needs you in black and white letters. And I was just like, wow. They don't have to put the message on the sticker anymore. Like, what does that mean? What does Smokey needs you mean? Who's Smokey? The bear? Right. So Smokey's this guy. So they didn't have his picture on there. They just said Smokey needs you. And instantly I was like, yes, sir, I know what to do. It's like that sticker was a key to unlock a message that was already in my head, right? And we all have this message if we grow up in this society since we were like wee big, because we know there's this bear named Smokey that wants us to do something, right? And the fact that they didn't have to put that message on the sticker struck me, because that meant they spent a lot of money making sure the message was on all of our heads already. So all they had to do was remind us, and it's enough. So who funds Smokey the Bear? The Park Service, or the Forest Service thing, they co-sponsor it, kind of. But I'm going to go a lot deeper with this story. So the same entity that funds Smokey the Bear also puts out things that say, don't drink and drive, pick up your litter, tutor kids after school, wear a seatbelt, wear a condom, join the military, all kinds of things that seem like nice messages, right? Who is this? They brag that they have 400 impressions per person in this country per year. That's more than once a day you're seeing messages from the same entity. So you all know who this is, but maybe subconsciously. So who actually knows who I'm talking about? To hear it? Okay, so you're all going to recognize this. You've seen this around. You all have seen this, right? But who the hell's the Ad Council? They've been in all of our heads, and yet we don't even know their name, and we see them at least once a day. And they've all taught us about Smokey the Bear and everything else. Once I saw a full-page ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer's, like full page, and it said, and now we're to thanks to our sponsors, thanks. And I had the Ad Council block logo, and the backdrop was all small print of all these giant corporations that fund them. And half of them probably merged by now. That was in the 90s. So when I researched this, and I wrote an article, sorry, let you do it. I keep diving for it, off instinct. So I wrote this article called Occupy Earth Day several years ago, and I found that literally half of the top 100 corporations in the US fund the Ad Council in recent years. Why are they doing this?
Control the messaging.
To control the messaging, but what is the message? What's the common thread between all those messages that I just told you that they're telling us?
The individual needs to solve the problem.
As opposed to?
The corporation.
Right, that are funding the Ad Council. So the key word in Smokey's exact message is what? Word for word.
You.
Exactly. Only you could prevent forest fires, and the key word in there is you. So this is corporate America speaking to us through one of the most effective propaganda channels that exists on this planet. Now they're starting to do Ad Councils in other countries too, to tell us that we shouldn't do what the community activists and high schoolers did when they teamed up in the late 80s and early 90s and mailed the styrofoam clamshells back to Oak Brook, Illinois to McDonald's corporate headquarters until they stopped using them. They don't want us to think to do that because they want us to think that litter is our fault, litter is our problem. Keep America Beautiful, same thing, just more specific to litter, funded by the waste and packaging industries, to derail our movement, to say that we're the problem. As long as we just focus on individual behavior, we won't be messing with McDonald's. We won't be doing things to change the corporate behavior and institutional behavior of the dominant institutions of our time, which are corporations, which control our government. So let's drill one step deeper, and then I'll be done my storytelling time. So when I was an undergrad, I was a sociology major, so shout out to sociology. And I had to read a book called A Different Mirror, A Multicultural History of the United States. Anyone familiar with that book? All right, busted out, good stuff. And one of the things that amazed me in that book was they were talking about in the plantations in the South, how when the workers got unruly, they would very intentionally racially divide their workers. They would exchange workers on their plantations, so they would have different races of people working together, and then they would treat one worse than the other. They would pay one less and get them resenting each other so they wouldn't fight their bosses. On the plantations of Hawaii, the sugar plantations, it was so intentional that the plantation owners sent each other memos that said, have this percentage of Japanese, this percentage of Filipinos, and situate them like this, and they all lived on hills, basically. And I think the expression, the shit rolls downhill, actually came from there, because the bosses lived on top of the hill, of course, and then there were no sewer systems, and one group literally was shitting on the other, okay, in terms of the disposal of their waste. And that was socially engineered because of the labor unrest on those plantations. And so we have this history in this country that goes way back to the beginning about using racism to divide people, and we now, of course, not just now, but throughout history, use sexism, heterosexism, wedge issues like guns and abortion. We chop people up into categories that 1% do, in every way other than by class, where it's okay if the middle class hate the poor and we're stigmatizing poor people so the middle class gets pissed at them. But if you start talking about the 1% versus everyone else, whoa. That's so dangerous of a thought form that the Obama FBI has to have crackdowns organized against Occupy camps around the country, because we can't let people think in the one way that will outnumber the 1%. And that's why we have this. And so I see the Ad Council as the most, it's like the scientific perfection of this divide and conquer strategy, because it's not just cutting people into groups, it's dividing us into individuals who we're starting to not even think in group identities and think that social change is just something we do on ourselves. You know, I'll plant my garden, I'll bring my bag to the thing, and I do all these things. But that's not enough. Like, if we're not fighting to change the system, then we're missing 16 out of the 17 principles and the principles of environmental justice that need attention, because we're just focusing on individuals. So, step off that soapbox. All right, let's go. So, in the 90s, when the environmental justice movement was gearing up, they challenged the big greens. They put out letters to EPA, to the big green groups, and were like, hey, you know, like these big environmental groups are way too white. Their positions are all messed up. They're supporting things that are harming communities, and that needs to be called out. And that's still, this day, needs to be called out. Not as badly as before, but almost as badly. And there's still a lot going on to that end. And more recently, we have Green 2.0, which has kind of taken the diversity part of it and be like, why are they not diverse enough? And you can see people of color in the U.S. are here, in science and engineering here, but environmental groups, major staff are down here. So there's still a lot to be done to just diversify big greens. But one of the problems with this, and I called this out when there was this panel of big greens at the second National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, 2002, bless you. And they put the token people of color from these big green groups were chosen to represent them. And I'm like, all right, that's really fucked up. But I'm sorry, I'm not sure where this is being broadcast, so I should be careful. But so I called this out, I'm like, these groups are basically putting people of color's faces on racist policies, because as Green.0 is challenging them to, they want to diversify the big greens, and you see Sierra Club having like diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff going on, and that's been challenged as well. But they're not trying to change their policies. They're not trying to think about, well, why are we still supporting carbon trading here in Virginia? In the literal shadow of the trash incinerator smokestack in Norton, where I was sitting in the hearing, and all these Sierra Club people are coming up saying, join trading. Well, the environmental justice movement is opposed to pollution trading because it screws communities like the one that we're sitting in during the hearing. And yet, like, Big Green's still not getting the message, and they think, well, if we just hire the right people, then we don't have to change our policies because we'll look diverse, and that's okay. So it's not okay. It's not enough. Go ahead. So there's a lot of cool things document-wise that came out of the second National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. You'll find that on the website that you see on your handout, so check that out at some point. Dumb is no longer with us either, unfortunately. Richard is, though. He's great. And they challenged EPA as well, and we'll see more on them. The next slide. So when EPA was responding to this idea of environmental justice, this environmental racism being challenged by the movement, and EPA specifically being called out for how racist they are, they reacted by creating an environmental equity working group. Now, what does that sound like? If we had environmental equity, what would that look like? Reparations? Is that what I heard? Yeah, that goes way beyond equity. That's like justice, so which is my point. So I'm not there yet, but you're close. But what would equity look like if we had like all the bad things, and we had equity?
Every group would have the same amount of pollution.
Every group would have the same amount of pollution. Is that what the principles asked for? There's nothing in there that says poisoning people equally. I didn't see any principles about that, right? It's asking for something far deeper, and yet the government's response at state levels too has been to talk in terms of environmental equity, which is the poison people equally doctrine that they're trying to institutionalize. And they're not even getting close to doing that, so it's not like we have any hope of that, and we're not even aiming for that. So I just reject this whole equality premise if we're talking about bad things, because they're alternatives to almost all the bad things. Now good things, that's another story. Go ahead. So they did this and they formed equity, and then later they changed the language to Office of Environmental Justice, but they kept the definition of equity. And so they just gave us a pat on the back as a movement, and they're like, okay, we'll use your word, but we're going to keep the same concept. So EPA's basically, go ahead, been hijacking this idea of environmental justice to mean something that fits in a pithy paragraph and not the 17 principles. So when you define it, when you talk about it, don't use EPA's redefinition. They don't have a right to define the environmental justice movement. The environmental justice movement defined itself. It took a whole page to do that. And so don't think that just because it fits on a brochure, you can be like, well, EPA's definition, no, that's not what it is. Now, when they looked at it, they did a study, this is in '91, they found that EPA takes longer to clean up toxic waste sites in communities, times higher in white communities. They're higher for other programs as well. And so this is institutional and like disparities in EPA's own enforcement, and this is still an ongoing problem. More recently, there was a report that showed that 95% of the civil rights complaints filed with the EPA in more recent years were just ignored or rejected or dismissed. And so that shows that there's no justice, even in the Office of Environmental Justice. Even under Obama, this was the case, okay? So it's not a Trump thing. Go ahead. All right, and this is just EPA's redefinition. We won't get into this right now. It's bogus, but come back to that. And so basically we're talking about the difference between poison people equally, which is the equity idea, and stop poisoning people, period. There's a similar concept is NIMBY versus NIABI. So you all heard of NIMBY, right? What's not in well, I just said it. Long day. So not in my backyard, right, is NIMBY. So NIABI is not in anyone's backyard, and that's the principle that we operate on. So when we're helping a community, we won't tolerate them saying, oh, we'll just build it in this other place, in this other community. We're like, no, if it's not good enough for you, it's not good enough for them either. We have to help them next. And so we make sure that groups are supporting each other and helping defend the next community that may have the company jump to them to try to pollute them next. And by doing that solidarity, we're creating huge change in that we're knocking out 50, upwards of 99% of each wave of bad industrial development in terms of the energy and waste sectors that I've been following, one community at a time, but networked and supporting each other so that we're not just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but we're actually reshaping entire industries. Okay, so to underscore this idea why I don't support equity, there's some examples. In one study that was done around 2000, they looked at dioxin pollution, the most toxic chemicals known to science, coming out of mostly incinerators. And there was one in a black community, black and Vietnamese and Hispanic actually, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that was the worst polluter in the country for dioxin. And they looked at how much dioxin was ending up in the Canadian Arctic at 8 sites. And the worst polluter for that was actually in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And then Ames, Iowa is the other one, small burner there. And so this stuff travels really far. So if you took these incinerators and moved them, like the one in Harrisburg, a few miles away into a white suburb, that pollution is still going to disproportionately be impacting the food web for the indigenous people in the Canadian Arctic who have no choice to grow things in the ground because it's way too cold for that. They're eating a lot of animal fat that concentrates these toxins. And so you still have unequal exposures, even if you move around the sources and rearrange things that way. Same thing with mercury and dioxins and things that end up in fish that certain ethnic subpopulations eat disproportionate large amounts of fish. And it's not going to matter where the smokestack was because the stuff travels too much, so it's still disproportionately going to impact people. Same thing with fluoride as well. Fluoride increases the amount of lead that leaches out pipes and is absorbed into the brain. And even though it's mostly done in communities of color, in urban communities, it also, in those communities, disproportionately impacts black and Hispanic people who have more lead absorbed into the brain than white people do, which is strange, but scientists think it's because of racial differences in calcium absorption. Nonetheless, it's affecting the population, our ability to learn and think and behave properly. Go ahead. So the justice approach, basically, I don't think there is such a thing as an environmental justice law. Anything that's actually an environmental justice law is going to be called something else. Because anything that's called environmental justice law is basically an equity law. Because they can't do anything else than that. They don't tend to in these policies. So the things that would be are things that affect everyone. So if we're banning like polystyrene, like we just did recently in DC and Baltimore, got styrofoam bans, that affects everyone. If we ban other bad things or just change the whole system, that's going to disproportionately benefit the people who are disproportionately impacted by the negative consequences. So these are environmental justice laws, but they're not going to be called that because they're not trying to say just we're trying to help certain people, because legally we can't even look at race in laws because then, I don't know, it's this weird color blindness interpretation by the courts, but they don't let you do that. Go ahead. So for good things, equity is justice. So we want equal access to all the good things, and that is cool if we're talking about it that way. Okay, and for some things I put in the necessary evils category. So some of these things, no one wants to live next to the recycling facility or live next to the elevated train system, but we need these things. So we need to make sure we insulate them from community impacts as best we can. All right, so let's run through some examples and then I'll wrap up. So in North Carolina, there's a study that was done of sewer lines, and you can see, based on, it's hard to see all the colors in here, but the shading shows that people of color on the outskirts of town are the ones that are not actually having access to the sewer lines. Go ahead, next one. Same thing in Modesto, California. With the Hispanic population, you see all around the areas where the sewer lines access. Next one, same thing with street lighting as well. So the white areas get access to the street lighting. Now, we have a mapping site that you're welcome to use, the only tool out there that makes census, race, and class data very easily navigable with a Google Maps interface. So you can go on here, justicemap.org, you can zoom in very fine to any areas. There's an advanced mode where you can do all kinds of neat things. And I use this when I'm trying to figure out, is this community like characterized a certain way, who's impacted, can make really colorful maps and do all kinds of stuff. I can do a training for you sometime if you want. And this is one of the things we did with this. So we also, on our Energy Justice site, we have a mapping site that brings in the race data and class data from Justice Map. And so you can plot where all the polluting facilities, existing and proposed ones are. This is the DC area. And you can see this is the wealthiest black county in the country, in Prince George's County, Maryland. Yet they have this cluster of gas-fired power plants, landfills, the state's only sludge incinerator. This is Lorton, Virginia, where you'll see some slides on that next. A lot of other waste stuff is concentrated. It's a nice looking community, except they built it right next to 2 incinerators and 3 landfills. And they used to have DC's prisons there. And this is a good example of the chicken and the egg of environmental justice. And so you ask, like, well, did the polluters come to people, et cetera? They had locked up mostly black people from DC in Lorton, Virginia since like 1910. And then they started putting landfills next to it so close that gases got into the prison, blew up and killed one of the prisoners at one point. That's how close it was. And then they shut down the prisons in 2001, built this nice looking community literally on their dividing walls on 3 sides of the community. The southern horizon, this is the western horizon, there's a landfill behind that. This is one of the largest trash incinerators in the country. And then the southern horizon is another landfill, and then there's a 3rd landfill and a sludge incinerator. So it's just all surrounding them. And people didn't know, but they moved to this where the industries already were, and it was probably the housing market, realtors redlining essentially and saying, well, these are the places you can afford, or this will be a nice place for you, go ahead. You'll see this is where all the people of color in Fairfax County are concentrated, and some other pockets too. And go to the next slide. And economically, you can see it's lower income, but still high income compared to the state and national average. It's just a very rich county. So what we see here in Prince George's County, Maryland, and other examples is underscoring the idea that race is more of a factor than class. You can have wealthy people of color and they're still going to get all this concentrated stuff dumped on them just because they can and get away with it in these areas. All right, so overall, and then we'll look at Virginia for a few slides. So when I looked and analyzed 10,000 dirty energy and waste facilities in the country and asked, instead of just looking like past studies on toxic waste and race did at just one industry, we looked at all the stuff we could. Big universe, 10,000 facilities, and said, well, where is this stuff tending to be? And what we found that within 1 mile, the average income was slightly higher than average. I was shocked, actually. I thought it would be slightly lower, but it was slightly higher than average. And the average white population was 55%. Now you might think, well, why are we calling it environmental racism then if it's mostly white and it's above average, it's not race or class, right? But the average white population in the country is actually 64%. And so when you look at that way, it's not so extreme that everything's in a black community. I mean, that would be horrific. I mean, it's bad enough the way it is. But it is skewed enough that if things were fair, white people would be experiencing 64% of the damage and not 55%. And that's because other communities are making up for that difference. But it underscores that race is more of a factor than class, and environmental racism is still real. It's just not as extreme as sometimes it's billed to be. So this is just the data to back it up. We don't have to belabor this right now. So we have a tool at justicemap-api.org which allows us to look at whole industries at a time, and that's how I came up with the next few slides. So let me just walk you through those real quick. So the way this works is if things follow the one line, that means it's equitably distributed. So if it's above that line, people are getting more damage. Below that line, they're getting less damage. Then it would be fair if it were all equal. And these are all different racial groups. So the red one is white population. So that skirts under the average for most distances all the way out to 250 miles from dirty energy and waste facilities in this country. And so white people are getting less damage than they should if things were equal. A lot of other groups getting more damage. Go ahead. Skip a few. We'll just go to Virginia. Okay, back one. Okay, wait. Okay. So I decided to look just at Virginia so I could present to you today, so you're not just looking at national figures here. And if we look at coal plants, okay, here's people being equal. Right? This is the one line. Now, this is the Asian population. Actually, the Asian population jumps out a lot in our data for some reason at closer distances, and we still don't have a good explanation why. But once you get to 1 mile, the black population flies above all the other ones. So in Virginia, who's exposed to coal plant pollution? it's black people getting very disproportionately impacted by it. And this could still be the case even if it's mostly white people in these communities, but it's more black people than it would be if it were equal, and that's the point. That's why it's discrimination. Go ahead. And when you look at by class, you find that 1 is all the way up here. So it's lower income people, but in the case of coal, that are mostly being impacted. That's not going to be the case for the rest of these, though. So landfills, this is probably because of Lorton, the Asian population, in really close proximity from the picture I showed. But for the rest of this, black folks disproportionately impacted by landfills in Virginia. And it's higher than average income in general. So it's not a class thing, it's more of a race thing. Same thing with trash incinerators. Black population jumps out after you get to about 2 miles. Because of Lorton, you have Asian population very high at closer distances too. And above average income by far, because 2 of the incinerators are in Northern Virginia. Gas plants is most extreme. The black population is very high compared to the rest of them, and this is what some of you are finding the pipelines around this. This is to serve power plants that are disproportionately impacting black people more than almost any other industry. Go ahead. And this is by class. You can see that it's kind of even in terms of income, slightly lower, but for the most part close. So last slide, and this is from New Jersey. New Jersey looked at things in a cumulative way as well, and they looked at by race and class, and combined a lot of factors, and they found that the closer you are to a polluting industry, or accumulations of polluting industry, exposed to, is directly connected to the color of your skin and the amount of money in your pocket. And this is the state government doing it, so it's not just us doing research, but like this affirms everything we're saying done in state government level. All right, so I'll just leave it there. Thank Matt time, hopefully, not too over. So we're Kendall, you want to switch over to yours?
I'm the director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. I promise not to keep you too long because I know we have Mary to get to, and I do not want to stand between her and you all because she has a wealth of knowledge as well. So let's just get started. So today Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, we're a faith-based organization. We work with people of all faiths to ensure environmental justice and healthy communities. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about this issue from a faith aspect, from a religious aspect, from a racism aspect, and to dive in a little bit into the context, the historical context. As you all know, the relationship between religion and race in American history is a very complex and varied one, and so I thought that would be an interesting contribution to our thinking and discussions today. You can just keep on rolling. Great. So I actually learned about this fairly recently. There was a really excellent environmental justice, indigenous justice historical film that the Richmond Interfaith Climate Justice League put on over at Elwood Thompson's, and the name of the documentary that we watched and talked about was The Doctrine of Discovery. And so basically the story talked about the age of discovery. So when we think about Christopher Columbus coming and setting his foot down here in the New World, what was the first thing that he did? Well, he performed a ceremony to take possession of the land for the King and Queen of Spain. And so this act of possession was actually based on a religious doctrine now known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And so even fewer people realize that today, 5 centuries later, the United States government is still using this archaic Judeo-Christian doctrine to deny rights. So, and then of course, when we think about this, when we actually look at what was issued by the Pope at that time, we find that it was an actual declaration declaring war against all non-Christians throughout the world. And specifically, it sanctioned and it promoted the conquest, colonization, and exploitation of all non-Christian nations and their territories. And so, yeah, you can keep on going. And so with what the Doctrine of Discovery left us with is basically a way of thinking that it was permissible to virtually ignore the most basic rights of indigenous folks and people of color that did not fit into that Christian box that they first laid out. And I guess the next thing that I want to talk to you all about is slavery. So you can kind of see how you've gone from the doctrine of discovery to slavery, with thinking of people not even in terms of being people and not deserving of the basic rights that should be inherent to all. So slavery was often justified in terms of religion. You know, there were folks on both sides, of course. We all know that the Quakers were early adopters of and advocates for during the abolitionist movement, and so they worked to be on that side of history, which is good. But we also know on the pro-slavery side, pro-slavery Christians would actually use the Bible, various portions, to look at and to completely justify there being slavery. So if you look at letters from Paul, he basically justified, he did not condemn slavery. He said, oh, well, you should be good slaves and listen to your masters. And also, in looking at the enslavement of African states, we also looked at, folks would use the Bible, specifically the curse of Cain, they understood that as to be a darkening of his skin. And so if God, the whole way of thinking was that if God were to make Africans different, no human could act, basically, to reverse this curse and to reverse the mark. If they were deemed to be different, taken as inferior, then that would mean that, it's not man's role to do this. So even looking outside of, even looking in the abolitionist movement, there were still Christians that thought about it in that terms, as in, although African Americans should not be enslaved, that does not necessarily mean that they are equal. They should still be seen as inferior. And so, of course, at the same time that we were, during this time, as ideas of blackness were looked down upon, at the same time ideas of whiteness and inherent superiority, alongside the Christian arguments for slavery and black inferiority. So this was all happening at the same time. So you can keep it moving. So that brings us to, the 1900s. And then I just included a slide here about the prophetic black church. And so because of segregation, black folks were segregated, of course. They were forced to be in their own spaces. And so these places were black spaces, and so that they could ensure their own conversations and their own social justice movements and their own organizations and their own spiritual growth and civic engagement. And so these spaces, these churches and these homes were places for community organizing. And when I say prophetic, what I mean about a prophetic religion is that it challenges society. It's a social critique about the corruption that we see around us. So that's what it is to be prophetic. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was environmental racism from a faith perspective. Mike did an excellent job of laying out environmental justice, so I am going to, and environmental racism, so I'm going to skip over this. But if you have a chance to check it out later, or if you want to share some of what you've learned here today, there's a really great short YouTube video on environmental race. The title of it is Environmental Racism. Racism is the New Jim Crow, and it's put out by The Atlantic, and it's on YouTube. It's very easy to find, but it does a great job of succinctly explaining, and you can keep on going. Great. So I'm coming to my close here, and so I wanted to set out a historical context just to kind of shine some light on both how religion in the past has been used to condemn and oppress, but also how it can be used to uplift and liberate people. And so I really see environmental justice as being both a spiritual and justice issue. And so we know that a lot of these environmental issues intersect with issues that people of faith are already working on, like hunger, clean water, immigration, refugees, global conflict. And I guess the last thing that I'll add here is that most major religions already have a mandate to serve poor people, to look out for the least of these, to strive for a peaceful and just world. And environmental justice is a key way of thinking about that, and thinking about what the faith community brings to the struggle. Religion forms the cornerstone of our society. And even for folks that aren't particularly religious, you still have to kind of think about the context of how our society was started and how we got the laws that we ended up with. And then the last thing, of course, the religious community also brings in extensive networks and institutions, schools, universities, hospitals, and so they engage millions and millions of people around the world. And so you keep it moving. And so just wrapping up here, so this slide looks at some of the major spiritual traditions and how they call for us to be stewards of creation. And of course, when I say creation, I mean what was created by the Creator or creators. So when you think about that, a lot of times people think about it in either or thinking, like the environment or people, the earth or society. But dichotomous thinking is one aspect of white supremacy culture, and so we should all recognize that not only are we standing on the earth, but we are the earth right now. And so when major spiritual traditions are called to care for creation, that also means being a faithful steward of creation also means being a faithful steward of each other, our neighbors far and near. And one thing I wanted to add here, so I mentioned white supremacy culture, and there's a really interesting resource that I would like to shout out to you all. It's from Dismantling Racism, and it's especially for organizations to identify white supremacy culture and how it shows up in organizations. And so if folks haven't had a chance to check that out, I really recommend it. And I will end here. Thank you so much.
Did you mention some of the things that your group's doing in Virginia with environmental justice?
Yes, I can, but I just didn't. How much time do we have left?
You didn't have to, just maybe just a little quick.
Well, you can keep.
As well?
Yeah. So Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, as I said, we're working with faith communities and congregations across the state. We do community dialogues and workshops. We provide resources. For example, we're coming out soon with a Ramadan calendar. We also have a film library, and we have a partnership program. I have additional information on the table about all of the different programs and offerings that we have if you want to get involved. Can you hit it again? Hit it again. And so some examples of standing up to environmental racism that's happening here in Virginia. So we heard about Reverend Paul Wilson earlier. That's who Travis showed the video clip of. And Mary mentioned that they're having their Earth Day vigil on Sunday, April 22nd. We'll actually be doing a carpool down there, so if anybody would like to come with us, please feel free. Travis mentioned that they are focusing on a air compressor station, and so it looks like the comment period for the compressor station will open sometime next month. And from what we've heard, it looks like there will be a public hearing So if you're interested in these issues, please look out for the public hearing date, and also be sure to submit a public comment. So that's one of the issues that we've been working on. Last week before last, we delivered a letter to the governor asking for him to reject the pipelines. We had over 70 faith leaders from around the state sign on. We did that on the 50th anniversary of the MLK assassination. So some other local issues that I wanted to pinpoint: Queen Zakiya Shabazz. She has an excellent organization here in Richmond, United Parents Against Lead. She points out all of the many connections between environmental justice, social justice, criminal justice. She tells the story of, well, one of her children was lead poisoned, and so that's what started her activism. But she tells the story of, you know, working with folks in prison, and how some of the folks she works with have been lead poisoned. And so we know that lead poisoning can lead to more aggressive behavior. It can lead to more acting out, and so that's kind of an example of a connection that I know I didn't necessarily think about between criminal justice, the direct connection between criminal justice and environmental justice. And then Duran Chavis, he's another local Richmond activist. I don't think we've talked that much about food justice today, but I see that as, you know, another part of the environmental justice movement. And Richmond has, for this size city, Richmond has, I think it's either first or second in the U.S. in terms of the most food deserts, which is insane. And so Duran Chavis is doing groundbreaking work, bringing food to folks, and also working to uplift communities economically through urban farms and urban agriculture. And how much more time do I have? I think I have a little. Well, those are my examples, and then just some ways you can take action. I have some Creation Care voter pledge cards. I also have some information about the partnership program, and then the one last thing I wanted to mention is the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative and the Governor's Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. And if you hit it one last time, you'll see a picture of Governor McAuliffe signing EO 73, setting the stage for Mary to come and talk to you all a little bit more about the council.
I'm going to talk for a moment about two solutions, which are the two that Kendall just mentioned, the Advisory Council and the Collaborative. But when we move past that, we want to hear from you, so I hope you're thinking of questions and comments and discussion. There's a lot of knowledge in the room about more environmental problems in Virginia and environmental racism for sure, whether we're talking about the Richmond area or other communities in Virginia. So we do hope to have those discussions. Feel free to direct questions to our presenters and we can talk about that more. But I want to talk about two solutions that I think are very exciting. But they're baby steps, and they both involve citizen engagement. And so unless we really get pressure and support from all over the state, I think that their effect is probably going to be smaller than it could be. So as Kendall Crawford just mentioned, we have the Environmental Justice Collaborative. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, so this is great for me to be able to talk about this. It's been around since 2015, and basically it's a group of 16 organizations that are increasingly formalizing their collaboration and their partnership. A lot of what we do is during monthly phone calls, but we've actually gotten a grant from the Mertz Gilmore Foundation. We're going to have our first staff, so we're in a hiring process right now. So I'm sure you know a lot of these organizations. Our vision is a clean and healthy environment for all Virginians. And we've already heard, for example, of some of the member organizations, one, of course, being Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, another United Parents Against Lead, which you just heard about Queen Zakiya Shabazz. One of the things she also talks about, besides the prison, which there's a whole organization called Prison Ecology that looks at environmental racism in our jails, and it's huge. It's definitely an issue here in Virginia. But she also looks at lead poisoning from the water fountains in Richmond schools. So that's something, if you've been looking at Flint, just to know that yes, we do have a problem with lead here in Richmond, and there are people organizing around that issue.
So the collaborative is made up of community-based organizations or grassroots organizations, green organizations, faith-based organizations, and academic institutions. My academic institution, University of Richmond, is the only partner, so maybe Dr. Williams will get a VCU commitment as well. And so we're really excited about being able to move that forward. If you're interested in getting more information, I'm not putting up my slides, but I'm going to say some other things. This is my email, mbrook@richmond. Please send me an email, or I have my card if you would like me to send you my slides, which were filled with text, so I don't think it's going to work well right here. The other thing I wanted to tell you about, so this environmental collaborative has been working since 2015. One of our main proposals, and we put it in front of the governor when he was asking about reduction of pollution from our power plants. We said there really needs to be an Environmental Justice Advisory Council for the state of Virginia. It exists in a dozen states. We're really far behind that curve. We have a lot of need, and you're not addressing it within your state government. He actually heard the message, and he created an Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It was announced on Halloween, I believe. I'm a member of that council. I would love to talk to you about what we're doing. I think there's a lot of potential there, but I think that it really needs a lot of pressure from citizens. So it is a citizen advisory group. There's representatives from all over the state. You can find it on the Secretary of Natural Resources website for the state government. If you look under initiatives, the top one is this Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. I want to mention two things from that, and then you're all on, so I hope you're thinking of your questions and your discussion points. We've had a couple of subgroups. So the first subgroup that we had was looking at ED11, which was looking at whether we were going to join RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and how the state will address cap and trade, whether we'll become involved in cap and trade, what are some of the environmental justice issues linked to cap and trade, and there are a lot of them. I hope you all have been paying attention to that. That comment period just closed, and we had a subgroup that was working on that and put in comments to the governor and others. The second subgroup that we have is on environmental justice and pipelines. So you've been hearing about Buckingham. Certainly that would be one of the cases we would look at, but the Chesapeake Connector is also in communities of color. So the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, definitely between the counties that it goes through, between the location of its compressor stations, and between the location of where its connectors are, definitely is having a disproportionate impact on people of color. So there is, of course, environmental justice with issues with this pipeline. As we know, it's pretty far along in the approval process, but the Buckingham compressor station has not been approved. The federal level approval process I would consider to have been very, very weak. They didn't have local ecological data. They did not look at the emissions. They did not consider it an African American community, even though we know that it is. They took the county at a broader level, so it looked like it wasn't an environmental justice issue. So first of all, the subgroup of the Advisory Council has a pipeline meeting on the 20th. I can send you more information. It's from 10 to 12. It's down in Patrick Henry Building if anybody would like to come in person, but all of our meetings are open to the public through telephone. So if you send me an email, I will also send you the line to call in. And then our next Advisory Council meeting is going to be held in Buckingham so that we can hear from impacted populations directly, and that's going to be May 30th. So if people would be interested, again, you can always call in, but you can also attend in person. Everything we do is open to the public with notice, and it's always up on the Secretary of Natural Resource websites to get that information, or feel free to send me emails. We hope that you engage in both of those things, the collaborative and also giving feedback to the council, because it's really important that we hear from people in Virginia that they find this stuff important, that they really want more information, that they're pressuring the governor, that they're pressuring the Secretary of Natural Resources, and that they want change. So I'm going to stop there, and I really want to hear feedback, ideas, questions, comments. We've got our speakers here. Obviously, Dr. Williams has a ton of knowledge himself. So let's just start with, do we have clarification questions? And then maybe we'll move into some of the more deep discussion, and then at some point we're going to break up and talk independently. But who has a clarification question? Did anybody have something when they were hearing the presentations, like, oh, I wish they would spell that piece out?